In the annals of history, there are deaths so disturbing they're whispered about, not recorded. This is one of them. He was not a soldier, not a killer, not a tyrant. He was a man of words, a philosopher, a spiritual rebel, and for that, he was buried standing up, his mouth packed with ash, his face bound to a stone so he could never look toward heaven again. No grave marker, no ceremony, just a silent, vertical tomb, hidden beneath the monastery he once dared to question. The church said it was justice. His followers called it a curse. And for centuries, they denied it ever happened. But the bones were real. And when they were finally found, they were still upright. This is the story of a forgotten heretic whose death was more than a warning. It was a message etched into bone, one the church tried, and failed, to erase. Because when you punish a man like this, you don't silence him. You make him immortal. Now, for the first time, the truth is being exhumed. Welcome to the lost execution of the standing corpse. Say a prayer. And prepare yourself. This is not the version of history you were meant to know. He arrived with nothing but a satchel of parchments and a strange calm in his eyes. In the cold dawn mist of 14th century France, a man named Brother Emmerich crossed the threshold of the Abbey of St. Lys, one of the oldest and most politically protected monasteries in the region. On paper, he was just another cloistered scholar, a monk, a man of vows. But beneath his hood, Emmerich carried something far more dangerous than heresy, doubt. He wasn't born into power. He didn't come from nobility. He had no wealth, no military claim, no bloodline of any consequence. What he did have, what the church feared most, was a mind unwilling to kneel. Even early on, his writings struck a chord among younger initiates. He questioned why the poor suffered while bishops dined like kings. He asked why confessions were sold like indulgences. And worst of all, he proposed that salvation might not require the church at all. He didn't scream these ideas from pulpits. He whispered them behind abbey walls. And that whisper grew into a current, a quiet wave among novices who began to ask the same forbidden questions, who began to look at their superiors not with awe, but with suspicion. At first, they called it youthful zeal, then intellectual arrogance. But it wasn't long before the elders of St. Lys realized Emmerich wasn't preaching heresy. He was planting it. The monastery had survived plague, famine, and war. But a single voice? A single monk unafraid to defy centuries of doctrine? That could collapse the entire foundation from within. By the winter of 1329, his teachings had been copied by hand and smuggled into 4 different dioceses. A manuscript titled Deus Absconditus, the Hidden God, began to circulate underground. It argued that divine truth required no intermediary, that the soul could reach God without confession, relics, or even priests. To the average peasant, it was hope. To the church, it was wildfire. And they were prepared to do anything to extinguish it. The turning point came in spring, during a seemingly harmless debate inside the abbey library. Emmerich, surrounded by younger monks, challenged a passage from the City of God by St. Augustine. He asked, aloud, whether suffering was truly redemptive or simply a tool used to keep the faithful obedient. The room went silent. A senior monk, red-faced and trembling, accused him of blasphemy on the spot. What Emmerich said next sealed his fate. If this is the voice of God, then God must fear us thinking for ourselves. Within hours, an official report was dispatched to the local bishopric. 2 days later, Emmerich's quarters were raided, his manuscripts confiscated, his students interrogated, and Emmerich himself was placed in a stone cell beneath the chapel, without trial, without scripture, without light. But this was only the beginning. Because when the church doesn't know how to silence a man, it looks to the Inquisition. And they don't deal in silence. They deal in erasure. They never tortured him. Not in the way you'd expect. There were no racks, no flaying knives, no red-hot tongs. Emmerich's punishment came in the form of silence, the church's cruelest innovation. A monk who questioned holy doctrine was not worth the dignity of martyrdom. He would be broken not with screams, but with neglect. For 63 days, he was left alone in the bowels of St. Lys. No books, no visitors, no Massachusetts, just cold bread, stale water, and stone walls that dripped like they wept. But Emmerich did not go mad. He wrote, scratching into the mortar with a shard of bone, possibly his own. He carved out lines of heretical poetry, reinterpreted psalms, and coded invectives against church corruption. His words, though faint and ragged, were sharp enough to outlive centuries. Some still remain etched in the chapel's foundation. The stone that refuses to kneel becomes the altar. Those who eventually entered his cell expected a broken man. What they found instead was a prophet, and that terrified them. Outside his cell, a storm brewed. The bishopric of Languedoc had taken notice. So had the Dominican order. Whispers of a new Luther before Luther were spreading among disillusioned novices across southern France. And worse still, parchments matching Emeric's prose were surfacing in towns hundreds of miles away. The Inquisition, always eager to crush sparks before they became fires, descended on the monastery. Not with soldiers, but with scribes, confessions, and threats. They didn't need to prove Emmerich guilty. They only needed the illusion of justice. So they fabricated a tribunal, a secret trial, held not in a court but in the crypt of Saint-Lys itself. The attendees? A handful of high-ranking abbots, 2 inquisitors from Avignon, and a silent Emmerich, chained, starved, but unblinking. There was no defense, no witnesses, only questions designed to damn. Did you write Deus absconditus? Do you deny the authority of Rome? Do you believe salvation exists outside the church? To each, Emmerich gave the same answer. I believe truth does not require permission. The inquisitors needed no more. But there was a problem. Burning him would make him a martyr. Hanging him would draw attention. Even drowning had symbolism they couldn't risk. No, this required a punishment so unnatural, so humiliating, that no soul would ever dare follow his path. They called it intermentum erectum, burial standing up, a sentence reserved for only the most dangerous heretics, those whose very ideas could not be allowed to rot peacefully in the ground. They would entomb him alive, upright, beneath the abbey itself. A wall would be sealed over the niche. No headstone, no name, and no record, as if he had never existed. But the church underestimated something, because a man buried upright does not sleep. He waits, and what came after his burial would haunt the abbey of Saint-Lys for generations. There is a peculiar chill that follows inquisitors. Not like winter, not like death. It's a spiritual cold, the kind that drains color from stone and silence from rooms. When the Inquisition set foot in Saint-Lys, everything changed. The bells rang differently. The prayers stiffened. Monks avoided one another's eyes. It was as if God himself had left the building, and something else had taken his place. The 2 men who arrived were not merely priests. They were engineers of fear. Father Bastien of Avignon, called the Mirror because he reflected guilt in everyone he met. Their first act was the public scriptorium purge. Dozens of texts were burned, including works that had nothing to do with heresy. Philosophy, poetry, apocryphal gospels, anything that might inspire independent thought, not because they weren't guilty, but because they feared something worse than execution, burial like his. Whispers spread that Emmerich was still alive, that he had scratched prayers into his tomb, that monks heard knocking beneath the crypt during vigils. The abbots dismissed it as superstition, but fear is a heresy the church could not suppress. So Father Bastien ordered an exorcism of the lower abbey, not to cleanse spirits, but to send a message. What lies beneath is no longer a man. It is the devil's whisper made flesh. To the Inquisition, this was a spiritual war. And in war, you don't just kill the body, you annihilate the memory. Calvus commissioned a black registry of all monks who had studied under Emmerich. One by one, they were reassigned to faraway cloisters, silenced with vows of obedience, or simply vanished. Records were altered, birth ledgers forged. Emmerich's family, what remained of it, was told he had died in a plague. The very idea of him was suffocated. But something unexpected happened. The heart of the church tried to erase Emmerich. The more persistent his myth became. A peasant girl in Toulouse claimed she had visions of a man bound in stone who spoke in fire. A monk in Marseille reported a dream of a vertical tomb bleeding from its cracks. A hidden sect, later known as the Lucent Brothers, began circulating pages allegedly copied from Deus absconditus. The Inquisition doubled down. They exhumed graves, burned followers, silenced entire villages. But nothing could explain what happened in Saint-Lys 3 years after Emmerich's disappearance. When renovations began on the east transept, a team of masons broke through an ancient wall. Behind it, They found a cavity, dry, hollow, sealed tight. Inside stood a skeleton, upright, arms bound, jaw broken open. In the center of its chest, a wedge of stone inscribed with a single word, veritas. Truth. It wasn't documented. It wasn't reported. Because the inquisitors ordered the entire crew to swear an oath under penalty of damnation. The wall was rebuilt. The workers reassigned. The records vanished. But the story did not. Because one of those masons, racked with guilt, haunted by dreams, kept a journal. Centuries later, it would resurface. And with it, the first undeniable proof that Emmerich had been buried standing up. Not as a warning, but as a relic. There was no sunlight, no crowd, no parchment trail. Just stone and silence and a sentence whispered so faintly it didn't echo. The trial of Brother Emmerich was never meant to be remembered. It wasn't held in a courtroom, chapel, or even within the monastery's legal archives. It took place underground, beneath the Abbey of St. Lis, in a crypt not used since the Black Death. A place reserved not for justice, but for disappearance. At the center of that crypt stood a crude stone chair. It wasn't designed for comfort or ritual. It was a throne of humiliation, cracked and carved with Latin phrases warning of eternal damnation. They chained Emmerich to it by the wrists and neck, not to restrain his body, but his defiance. The men presiding over the proceedings weren't legal clerics. They were inquisitorial proxies, handpicked for their loyalty, not their wisdom. Their purpose was clear, not to evaluate guilt, but to make it permanent. No scribe was present, no documentation made. Only the inquisitors, the abbot, two high-ranking monks from Avignon, and Emmerich. He never looked afraid, and that terrified them more than any rebellion. The trial lasted under an hour. The charges? Dissemination of forbidden theology, undermining church authority, incitement of intellectual insubordination, and perhaps most damning of all, spiritual seduction, inspiring monks to believe they could reach God without the church. When asked if he repented, Emmerich raised his head, not in pride, but in mourning, and replied, "I pity a church that fears light more than darkness." That was the last thing he ever said. The verdict was swift, a unanimous declaration of heresy. But it wasn't the punishment that shocked even the inquisitors. It was how it was to be carried out. Burial upright, mouth filled with ashes from his own manuscripts, hands bound with beads soaked in lamb's blood, body sealed behind stone in a posture of eternal shame, facing east, so he'd forever strain toward a sunrise he'd never see. A monk named Odin, young and frightened, was chosen to administer the final rites. But instead of reading from scripture, he later claimed to have whispered, "You are more alive than any of them." It was the only kindness Emmerich received in death. The abbey was silent the night it happened. No one spoke. No bells rang. No candles were lit. He was marched by torchlight through the lowest corridors, his feet bare, his robes torn, his head shaved in a parody of humility. A hood was drawn over his face, and when the wall was sealed behind him, the masons were ordered to say nothing. No cross was carved, no prayer spoken. It was done like a murder, not a burial. But secrets rot, and walls bleed. Over the next year, monks began reporting whispers during vigils, stones cracking in patterns, candles extinguishing for no reason. A novice claimed he saw Emmerich's shadow pass behind the altar, upright, unmoving, staring. The abbey dismissed them all as hallucinations. But a decade later, that same novice was found dead in the cloister garden. His body was twisted, face frozen in terror. Next to him, someone had carved one word into the dirt with a finger, veritas. What the church tried to contain was beginning to leak. Burial is supposed to offer rest, a return to the earth, a soft descent into forgetting. But intermentum erectum, standing burial, was the opposite. It was a punishment designed not to end a life, but to weaponize it. Used only in the darkest margins of ecclesiastical law, this sentence was reserved for those whose crimes threatened the church's very structure. Thinkers, not killers. Questioners, not rebels. Its aim wasn't just death. It was to destroy the soul's path to salvation, according to doctrine. Emmerich wasn't just executed. He was spiritually erased. Before the burial, his ashes, created from the burning of Deus absconditus, were packed into his mouth to silence the heresy he had spoken. a Dominican ritual that had only been recorded once before during the Qatar purges. His hands were folded, not in prayer, but forcibly wrapped in a chain of rosary beads, each bead dipped in lamb's blood to bind him in sacrificial sin. His body was placed inside a narrow vertical recess carved into the abbey's subfoundation. Not a grave, not a tomb. A wound in the architecture filled not with stone, but with a man. He was sealed upright, head bent down, chin forced to his chest. An iron circlet nailed into the wall behind him kept him from raising his eyes toward heaven. And as the final stones were laid, the inquisitors performed a reversal rite, a cursed liturgy spoken backward, designed to undo his name in the book of life. It wasn't mercy. It was obliteration. They believed that if a man's memory could be severed from the world, then so too could his influence. But the Inquisition misjudged one thing. Emeric's crime hadn't been in his words. It had been in what he awakened, the seed of divine independence. Even in the dark, it grew. Unknown to the church, one of the monks assigned to assist in Emeric's burial had stolen a single fragment of the manuscript before it was burned. A half-page from Deus Absconditus, hidden inside the lining of his robe. He fled saintless days later. He would become the first Lucent Brother, a secret sect of monks and scribes who began copying and spreading Emeric's theology in fragments. Not under his name, not in churches, but in underground catacombs, roadside inns, and dying villages, places abandoned by the church, where Emeric's words burned brightest. Centuries later, anthropologists would discover a strange pattern. In regions where Emeric's fragments had survived, incidents of clerical revolt, peasant uprisings, and mystic visions increased dramatically. The church had sealed him in stone, but his ideas had escaped. And in time, the heresy would speak louder than any sermon. But back in St. Lis, something else was happening. Something the church couldn't track with parchment or confession. The wall began to crack. At first, just hairline fractures. Easy to dismiss as structural decay. But then came the sounds. Scratching, clicking, a slow, rhythmic tapping from inside the wall. The abbey did what institutions always do when confronted with the impossible. They denied it. But not everyone did. Because across France, strange letters began appearing, written in unknown hands, and signed, yet all bearing the same phrase. He is not resting. It started with a leak. A trickle of water running down the east transept wall. Cold, blackened moisture that no builder could explain. There were no pipes, no aquifer, no visible damage to the foundation. And yet, every morning, the wall where Emeric had been buried stood wet, as if weeping through the stone. The abbot said it was a humidity issue, but the novices knew better. They whispered stories in the dormitories, of footsteps in corridors long abandoned, of candles that flickered when no wind blew, and of a presence so heavy near the crypt stairwell that it made grown men falter and forget their prayers. One monk, Brother Matthias, claimed that every time he passed the east wall at night, he heard a voice reciting psalms, but backwards. He was later sent away for spiritual confusion. He was never seen again, and still the wall leaked. By the mid-14th century, a new abbot had taken charge, a reformer named Alaric. Determined to cleanse the abbey's superstitions, he ordered an exorcism of the east wing. Holy water was sprinkled. Prayers were read aloud. But when the rite reached the final verse of Psalm 23, every candle in the nave went out at once. The officiating priest vomited blood and collapsed. He would remain mute until his death. Alaric had the area sealed off. Walls were reinforced. Access to the crypt was barred to all but the most senior clergy. A decree was written in secret. Under no circumstance shall the sealed chamber be disturbed. Let what lies within remain forgotten. It was an act of bureaucratic burial. But it came too late. Because in the town surrounding St. Lis, the curse had already begun to seep outward. Children born within view of the abbey tower were plagued with strange dreams of a man with ash-covered lips, standing in a room made of bone. Several nuns in a nearby convent began sleepwalking in the direction of the monastery. One was found pressed against the east wall, whispering, "Truth walks on broken knees." Worse still, unmarked manuscripts began appearing in local markets, fragmented, cryptic theology written in a style unmistakably similar to Deus Absconditus. No one could trace them. No one admitted to copying them. But people were reading and believing. The church, sensing the resurgence, launched another round of purges. Possession of any unauthorized religious text now carried the penalty of death. Dozens were burned in Toulouse. In Montpellier, a printer had his tongue cut out for reproducing an anonymous theological tract that quoted Emmerich verbatim. Salvation is not granted. It is remembered. Even still, the rumors spread. They spoke of the standing corpse beneath St. Lis, that he hadn't died, that his heart still beat, once every year, on the night of the original burial, that the wall would eventually split wide open and reveal a man untouched by time. Madness. Perhaps. But not to those who began flocking to the abbey under false pretenses, scholars, mystics, travelers from distant provinces. They came to walk the halls, to pass the wall, to listen, and some claim they heard it. A single knock, then another, then silence. 3 knocks. Always 3. No one dared to break open the wall. Not yet. But the cracks were widening, both in stone and in faith. And the church was running out of lies. They weren't supposed to find anything. That was the plan. When the Vatican quietly commissioned a restoration of St. Lis Abbey in 1891, it wasn't for preservation. It was for containment. The goal was to reinforce the east transept, redirect structural pressure, and, above all, never disturb the sealed crypt rumored to house the heretic. But plans fail, and Stone remembers. On a damp morning in April, a group of laborers broke through a thin, ancient barrier behind a bricked archway no one remembered. They expected rot, rats, dust. What they found instead were bones. Not scattered, not collapsed, arranged. An upright skeleton, bound by iron at the wrists and neck. Its jaw was broken, as if forced open. Inside the mouth, fragments of scorched vellum fused with ash and hardened over centuries like black stone. Etched faintly into the cavity wall behind the skull was a Latin word, veritas. Truth. The workmen fled. Within hours, the site was swarmed, not by clergy, but by archivists, historians, officials carrying Vatican seals and orders to observe only. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, samples sealed in lead-lined boxes. And then, just as quickly, the chamber was resealed. Nothing was announced. No press release. No formal discovery. Officially, the tomb didn't exist. But one photograph leaked. A single image, published anonymously in an underground Parisian pamphlet known for exposing suppressed church history, showed the vertical skeleton mid-excavation, its arms twisted inward, its spine still aligned, its head hung low. Beneath it, someone had scrawled, buried as a warning, unearthed as a prophecy. The church scrambled to respond. They dismissed it as forgery, claiming the bones belonged to an unknown plague victim mistakenly entombed upright due to medieval misunderstanding. But researchers weren't convinced, especially Dr. Claudine Rosset, a fringe historian from Lyon who had spent years studying banned monastic texts. She recognized the pattern of the stonework in the photograph. It matched an architectural blueprint she had uncovered in a hidden Vatican archive labeled Subversum, non-revelare, do not reveal. Rosset traced it back to a series of unmarked entries in inquisitorial ledgers from 1330, each referencing a disappearance at St. Lis, each followed by an annotation in red ink, Lex Silentiae, the law of silence. She began piecing it together. The legend of the standing corpse, the lost manuscript, the echoes of Deus Absconditus in rural mystic texts. But her work didn't go unnoticed. Within a year, her lectures were shut down. Her publisher received anonymous threats. Her home was broken into. And then, just before she was scheduled to speak at a symposium in Florence, she vanished. Her last known message was handwritten, delivered to a friend. The tomb is real. The church is afraid. And truth does not die standing still. No trace of her was ever found. But her research was uploaded by an unknown party to an encrypted server, accessed by a small circle of radical theologians and digital archivists. The file name? Emmerich.stillborntruth.zip. It contained more than blueprints and texts. It contained a scan, one final image taken before the crypt was resealed. It showed the interior wall of the tomb. In the plaster behind the skeleton's skull, almost invisible, scratched in with something sharp. I was not wrong. That simple phrase sent shockwaves through the fringe history world. Because it meant one thing. Emmerich knew they'd find him, not as a martyr, but as a message. And the message was spreading again. He should have stayed forgotten. That was the entire point of intermentum erectum, a punishment meant to be so humiliating, so complete, that even memory couldn't survive it. But the problem with burying ideas is simple. They don't decompose. By the early 20th century, whispers of the standing corpse at St. Lys had found their way into academic circles far beyond France. Banned seminaries, rogue scholars, underground mystics, all were asking the same question. What if the church hadn't silenced Emmerich, but enshrined him? In 1911, a secret collective calling themselves the Sons of Ash convened in Prague, made up of dissident theologians, excommunicated priests, and archivists from suppressed libraries. Their mission was simple: find the body, reclaim the text, reveal the truth. And they succeeded. On October 3, 1912, using forged credentials and heavy bribes, 2 members infiltrated the ongoing St. Lys renovations under the guise of architectural consultants. Their task? To open the tomb. If only for minutes. What they saw was never officially documented. But one of them, Anton Fuchs, a former Jesuit with a photographic memory, would spend the next year painting what he witnessed in obsessive detail. 37 canvases, all variations of the same image. A vertical skeleton, arms crossed in defiance, mouth wide, as if screaming through centuries. Behind him, glyphs, symbols, spirals. Not Latin, not Hebrew, something older. Anton's final painting was the most disturbing. The bones were intact, but around them coiled something black and root-like, spreading through the wall like a disease. Its title, Stillborn Prophet, Rooted in Stone. Anton died the same year. Suicide by self-immolation. His last words to a neighbor were, "He's still speaking." But the fire didn't stop the movement. It fueled it. Throughout the 1930s, Emmerich's story was weaponized by anti-clerical intellectuals, especially during fascist regimes that sought to manipulate faith for power. Copies of Deus Absconditus, whether authentic or not, began appearing in radical philosophical texts across Europe. The Vatican responded with silence and surveillance. But in 1968, the seal finally cracked. A Jesuit archivist working deep in the Vatican's restricted stacks leaked a document known only as Mandatum 1331A. It outlined, in explicit terms, the procedures for burying a heretic alive within church walls, including schematics for how to ensure upright decomposition and spiritual denial. There was no mention of Emmerich by name, but the location was unmistakable: Abbey of St. L, transept E depth, 11 feet. Ward, 4C. The document disappeared days later, but it was too late. Dozens of copies had already made it to underground networks. And suddenly, Emmerich was no longer just a legend or symbol. He was evidence. Evidence of the church's darkest ritual, of knowledge buried alive, of a soul they couldn't break, only seal. Then came the excavation. In 1971, under the guise of structural maintenance, French officials, pressured by both secular historians and private collectors, re-entered the crypt. And this time, they opened it fully. Photographs were taken, bones catalogued. A team of osteologists confirmed what was long suspected. Male, approximately 40 at time of death. Burial occurred while still alive, based on clawing marks on the stone manuscript, ash embedded in jawbone rosary, chain, fused to phalanges from long-term decomposition. Most shocking of all, the bones bore no signs of collapse. He had remained upright, spine locked, joints stiff even in death. That same year, the church issued a statement. These findings are regrettable misinterpretations of burial customs during a time of great societal upheaval. No such practice as described has ever existed within church doctrine. But their denial only raised more questions. And more visitors. Pilgrims began arriving in secret. Not Catholics, but seekers. People who believed Emmerich represented something the church had tried to kill, a direct path to the divine. No priest, no gatekeeper, no tithe, just truth. The crypt was resealed again in 1982, but not before someone left a message carved into the floor tiles. Truth was buried standing, so we would not forget to rise. Emmerich had become more than a man. He was a mirror held to power, a wound in the church's perfect skin, a corpse that refused to lie down, and in doing so, stood up for us all. What happens when the dead speak louder than the living? By the early 21st century, the name Emmerich had become a ghost note in the global subconscious, revered in hushed tones, dismissed in official channels, and dissected in corners of the internet, where forbidden theology bloomed like black mold. They called him many things: the standing prophet, the ashmouth heretic, the one who was not permitted to kneel. And in those circles, the story was no longer simply one of religious punishment. It was a cosmic indictment, a parable of spiritual totalitarianism, and a warning about what happens when truth is feared more than heresy. But now, people wanted proof. Real, physical proof. In 2006, a team of rogue theologians and data archaeologists launched Project Veritas, a collaborative effort to verify the standing burial, recover remaining fragments of Deus Absconditus, and trace its modern impact. They collected oral histories from towns near St. Louis. They unearthed anonymous confessions from elderly monks. They acquired scans of the hidden Mandatum 1331, a document, once again leaked from a Vatican subarchive. And then they found something stranger: patterns. In regions where Deus Absconditus fragments had taken hold, whether in ancient manuscripts, graffiti, or even in coded sermons, there were spikes in unusual religious behavior. Not cults, not riots, something else. People stopped obeying. Not violently, not rebelliously, quietly. They stopped going to confession, stopped paying indulgences, stopped listening to men in robes tell them who was saved and who was damned. In Guatemala, a priest was defrocked after preaching that God lives between questions, not answers. In Naples, a nun broke her vow of silence to declare, "The upright dead is more alive than those kneeling." None of these people knew each other. None claimed to know Emmerich, but his words were surfacing everywhere. It was as if the buried truth had developed a pulse. And still, St. Louis Abbey remained sealed. Until 2013, when, after a seismic tremor damaged the Abbey's east transept, workers were once again sent to reinforce the compromised chamber. This time, with more modern equipment. What they discovered made international headlines for about 8 hours. A partially exposed vertical tomb. Inside it, bones fused to stone, as if the skeleton had become part of the abbey itself. They found embedded ash in the walls, scriptural ash, verified to be ink remnants from parchment burned over 600 years ago. DNA samples from the surrounding dust matched Mediterranean heritage, age estimate 40 to 45. Even more chilling? Microfractures in the stone around the jaw and rib cage indicated movement, not at the time of burial, but after. It was as if, somewhere in the deep silence of centuries, Emmerich had struggled, not to escape, but to stand straighter. The Vatican responded with immediate classification. The chamber was sealed. The workers were silenced under NDAs and ecclesiastical pressure. But not before one of them, a Moroccan foreman named Salim, posted anonymously on a theology forum. "We didn't bury him. We discovered he was still standing. That wall wasn't a tomb. It was a prison door." That post disappeared within 24 hours. Salim did too. And now, there's nothing left to investigate. The abbey is closed to the public. The crypts are inaccessible. And Emmerich's name? Still not canonized. Still not taught. Still not acknowledged. But his echo remains. In books written in secret. In sermons whispered in exile. In the cracks of ancient walls that still weep in the night. Because when you bury a man for speaking the truth, you ensure the world never stops listening. Especially when he never laid down. Especially when he never broke. Why bury a man standing? Why deny him the peace of earth beneath his back, the softness of soil over his chest? The answer is darker than simple punishment. It is a statement, a living death, a warning carved in bone and mortar. Emmerich's upright tomb was not just a sentence, it was a symbol. By forcing him to remain on his feet in death, the church attempted to deny him the most human of dignities, rest. They sought to erase his presence from history, not by destruction, but by perpetual limbo, a punishment not only of the body, but of the soul. To the church, it was the ultimate heresy, to suggest that the truth could not be chained, that a man could stand alone in defiance, even when buried alive. But here is the cruel irony. By burying Emmerich upright, they ensured he would never truly be hidden. His body became a monument to resistance, his story a whispered legend passed between generations. His punishment was meant to silence a voice. Instead, it immortalized it. In centuries since, the image of the standing corpse has become a ghostly emblem for those who question power, who refuse blind obedience, and seek their own path to enlightenment. It reminds us that sometimes, the most dangerous thing is not a sword or a fire, but a man who refuses to kneel. Emeric's tomb beneath Saintless remains sealed, his bones locked in eternal vigil. But the message he left carved into stone and spirit cannot be buried. Because the truth, like a standing man, cannot be laid down. It will rise again. Thank you for watching this journey into a dark, forgotten corner of history, where faith and fear collide, and the price of truth was more than a life. If this story shook you, if it made you question what you know, please subscribe for more deep dives into history's shadows. Leave a comment with your thoughts or any forgotten legends you want uncovered next. And remember, sometimes the greatest heretics are those who simply stand up. Stay curious, stay vigilant, because the past is never as silent as we think.